Week 16 Fantasy Football Spotlights. In Desmond Ridder's first start, 11 of his 26 passing attempts went to Drake London, who the week prior saw 12 targets for Marcus Mariota. So obviously he is a big part of the game plan, and the Baltimore Ravens allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Kansas City usually means a pass-scripted game. They allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Tyler Lockett will miss this week due to the surgery on his finger. DK Metcalf, since the bye, has seen 15, 8, 10, and 9 targets and has had 3 of these 4 games with 18-plus fantasy points, 2 of them with 20-plus. Feel like he's due for a double-digit target game. The Panthers allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Weeks 8 through 15, he ranks number 3 in targets, number 2 in receptions, and number 5 in total fantasy points for the wide receiver position. 5 of these 8 games, he has hit 10-plus targets, 3 of them over 22 fantasy points. Jerick McKinnon has been the RB1 overall in back-to-back weeks. 4 total touchdowns in these 2 games. The receiving work is massive, 17 targets and 15 catches, 112 and then 70 receiving yards the last 2 games. Seattle is the second best fantasy matchup for running backs. DJ Moore had a solid week 15. It was a bounce-back game, 18.3 fantasy points, 5 catches on 6 targets for 73 yards and a touchdown. We saw in 2021 plenty of solid DJ Moore weeks with Sam Darnold as the quarterback. They get Detroit, who is a plus quarterback and plus wide receiver matchup for fantasy. Devonta Adams has had back-to-back weeks under 10 targets, which reminds me of weeks 7 and 8, where he also had back-to-back weeks under 10 targets, and then in week 9 he saw 17. The Steelers allow the 6th most points per game to wide receivers, and I feel like he's going to have another hyper-targeted week. Jerry Jeudy faces the Rams, who allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Jerry Jeudy is holding up the 3 because in week 14 he scored 33.3 fantasy points, scoring 3 touchdowns. 14.6 fantasy points last week. His 2 games prior to injury, he scored 16.6 and 18.3. Miami plays the Packers, who allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to running backs. If Jeff Wilson is out of the mix again this week, I'd look to Raheem Mostert, who just had 136 rushing yards last week. Rachaad White saw 16 touches last week, 18 the week prior, 15 in week 13. I feel like the potential in this game against the Cardinals, who allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to running backs, is going to be in his favor because they are playing Trey McSorley. Alvin Kamara is on a cold streak, but we had some positive signs last week. He had his most carries with 21 since week 5 and his most rushing yards with 91 since week 6. He faces the Browns, allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs. Hopefully this is his comeback week.